August 15, 1940, 11:23 in the morning. Flight Lieutenant James Hutchinson pushed his Spitfire Mark II into a climbing turn over the Kent countryside, his altimeter unwinding through 12,000 feet. Above him, maybe 2,000 feet higher, a formation of Messerschmitt 109s was positioning for attack. The German fighters had the altitude advantage, which meant they controlled the engagement. They could dive when they chose, build speed, and strike before the Spitfires could react. Hutchinson tried to climb faster. He pushed the throttle to the stop, felt the Rolls-Royce Merlin 12 engine straining at maximum power. The Spitfire climbed well, it was famous for that, but the 109 climbed better above 10,000 feet. German pilots knew this. British pilots knew this. It was simple physics. The Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine had a better supercharger. Maintained power at higher altitudes gave them the vertical advantage. And in fighter combat, altitude was life. The Germans dove. Hutchinson barely saw them coming. Tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. He broke hard left, G-forces crushing him into the seat, vision graying at the edges. The Messerschmitt flashed past, already climbing back to altitude for another pass. Hutchinson tried to follow, tried to gain height, but his Spitfire wallowed in the thin air. The Merlin was giving everything it had, but everything wasn't enough. The German was 2,000 feet above again within 30 seconds, lining up for another dive. This was how British pilots died. Not from lack of skill or courage, but from simple mechanical disadvantage. The Spitfire was a brilliant aircraft, but above 12,000 feet, the Messerschmitt could climb faster. That meant German fighters controlled the vertical dimension, dictated engagement terms, chose when to fight and when to break off. British pilots compensated with tactics, with desperation, with acceptance that some engagements were unwinnable from the start. But compensation wasn't solution. Men were dying. Hutchinson survived that engagement by diving away, trading altitude for speed, running for cloud cover. He landed at RAF Hornchurch at 11:57, with cannon holes in his wing and fury in his chest. He found his crew chief, a sergeant named Walter Davies, and spoke with the flat exhaustion of a man who'd just faced death and survived through luck rather than capability. Davies, our climb rate above 12,000 is rubbish. The 109s can sit up there and pick us off whenever they want. We need more power at altitude. Anything you can do? Walter Davies was 42 years old, too old to fly, but he'd spent 20 years maintaining aircraft engines. He knew Merlin engines like some men know scripture, understood their capabilities and limitations at a level that went beyond manuals and specifications. He looked at Hutchinson's battered Spitfire, at the young pilot who'd just articulated a problem that was killing British flyers every day, and made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. I might have an idea, sir. It's not exactly approved, but it might work. Give me 24 hours. What Davies knew, what most people didn't understand, was that the Merlin's altitude performance wasn't limited by the engine itself. It was limited by conservative boost settings, designed to prevent damage. Rolls-Royce had engineered substantial safety margins into their specifications, assuming pilots might abuse the throttles, that maintenance might be imperfect, that fuel quality might vary. But at RAF stations with good maintenance and consistent fuel quality, those margins were excessive. There was power being left unused, performance being sacrificed for theoretical reliability. Davies had been thinking about this problem for weeks. He'd watched Spitfires return from combat, heard pilots complain about climb rate at altitude, studied the technical manuals looking for margin, and he'd found it. The supercharger boost pressure was limited to 6 pounds per square inch for sustained operation above 10,000 feet. But the engineering specifications showed the supercharger could theoretically handle 9 pounds without failing. The 3-pound margin was safety buffer, not physical limitation. If you deliberately eliminated that buffer, if you pushed the supercharger harder, you get more power at altitude. More power meant better climb rate. The risk was catastrophic failure. Push too much boost through an engine, and the supercharger could disintegrate, sending metal fragments through the power plant at lethal velocities. Or the increased cylinder pressure could cause detonation, hammering pistons until they cracked. Or the additional heat could melt aluminum components. The Merlin wasn't designed to operate at 9 pounds of boost continuously. Rolls-Royce would void any warranty. The Air Ministry would court-martial anyone who authorized unauthorized modifications. But British pilots were dying because German fighters had altitude advantage. Davies wasn't an engineer. He didn't have authorization to modify anything. He was a sergeant, a mechanic, someone who followed orders and maintained equipment to specification. But he also understood that following specifications meant accepting German superiority at high altitude, meant watching pilots die from preventable disadvantage, meant letting bureaucratic caution kill British airmen. Sometimes the right thing and the authorized thing weren't the same thing. Sometimes you had to choose. That night, working alone in the hangar after the rest of the ground crew had left, Davies selected a Spitfire that had just come out of major inspection. Fresh engine, perfect condition, all systems within tolerance. If he was going to test his theory, he needed an engine that could handle the stress. He opened the boost control unit, a seemingly simple mechanical device that regulated how much pressure the supercharger could build. Inside was a spring-loaded valve that limited maximum boost. Davies carefully replaced the stock spring with one he'd fabricated himself, slightly stiffer, calibrated to allow 9 pounds of boost instead of 6. The modification took 3 hours of delicate work. When he finished, the engine looked identical to any other Merlin. Only someone who opened the boost control unit and measured the spring tension would notice the change. Davies signed off on the aircraft maintenance log with vague language. Boost control inspected and adjusted. Routine procedure. Anyone who looked closely would see deception, but most people wouldn't look closely. They'd assume a sergeant mechanic was doing his job according to regulations. The next morning, Davies found Flight Lieutenant Hutchinson before the morning patrol brief. "Sir, I've made some adjustments to Spitfire P7580. It might help with your climb rate problem. I need to be clear, this modification isn't officially approved. If the engine fails, it's on me, not you, but I think it'll work." Hutchinson studied Davies carefully. The sergeant's face was calm, but his hands were tense. This was a man taking a risk, gambling reputation, and possibly career on an engineering hunch. What kind of adjustments? Davies explained the boost modification, the increased supercharger pressure, the theoretical performance gain. Hutchinson listened with the focus of someone whose life depended on understanding technical details. "If this works, we get maybe 2,000 feet per minute climb rate above 12,000 instead of 1,500. Davies nodded. "That's my calculation. Maybe 25, maybe 30% improvement. Enough to match the 109s, possibly exceed them in vertical maneuvers. But sir, if the engine fails at altitude, you're gliding home if you're lucky, bailing out over the channel if you're not. The risk is real." Hutchinson thought about the Messerschmitt that had bounced him yesterday, about the helpless feeling of being unable to climb fast enough to defend himself, about the 3 pilots from his squadron who hadn't come back last week. "I'll fly it. If it works, I want you to modify every Spitfire in the squadron." The test flight departed RAF Hornchurch at 07:15. Hutchinson took the modified Spitfire to 15,000 feet over the Thames estuary, well away from the combat zone, where engine failure wouldn't mean immediate contact with the enemy. He climbed steadily, watching instruments with obsessive attention. Oil temperature, coolant temperature, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature. Everything looked normal through 10,000 feet. At 12,000, where the standard Spitfire's climb rate usually degraded, he advanced the throttle past the normal maximum. The boost gauge climbed past 6 pounds, 7, 8, 9. The Merlin's note changed, became harder, more urgent. The supercharger was screaming, forcing air into cylinders at pressure Rolls-Royce had never certified. Hutchinson felt the Spitfire surge upward. The rate of climb indicator showed 2,300 feet per minute. At 15,000 feet, in air too thin for most engines to maintain power, his Spitfire was climbing like it did at 8,000. The difference was dramatic, unmistakable, exactly what Davies had predicted. Hutchinson tested the engine for 20 minutes. Climbs, level flight, diving attacks, everything a combat sortie might demand. The temperatures stayed within tolerance. No unusual vibrations, no signs of impending failure. The Merlin was handling 9 pounds of boost without complaint, delivering performance that shouldn't have been possible according to official specifications. When he landed, Hutchinson taxied straight to Davies's maintenance bay and shut down the engine. The sergeant was waiting, nervous, trying to read the pilot's expression. "It works," Hutchinson said simply. "Best climb rate I've ever experienced in a Spitfire. Davies, you've just changed the tactical situation over southern England. How many aircraft can you modify?" Davies did quick mental arithmetic. "If I work nights, and if I can trust 2 other senior mechanics to help, maybe 12 aircraft in 3 days. But sir, this has to stay quiet. If the engineering officers find out we're modifying boost controls without authorization, they'll shut us down and probably court-martial me." Hutchinson nodded slowly. "Then we keep it quiet. Modify 12 aircraft. I'll make sure those 12 are flown by pilots who'll keep their mouths shut. We'll prove the concept in combat before anyone can stop us." Over the next 72 hours, Davies and 2 trusted mechanics, Sergeants Miller and Thompson, worked through the nights modifying boost controls on 12 Spitfires. They selected aircraft carefully, choosing only engines in perfect condition, recently overhauled, with no hint of wear or damage. The modification was delicate work, requiring precision and attention to detail. Each spring had to be calibrated exactly right. Too soft and the boost wouldn't reach 9 pounds. Too stiff and it might exceed safe limits and cause catastrophic failure. Davies hand-checked every installation, tested every aircraft personally before signing off. The 12 modified Spitfires were assigned to experienced pilots in Hutchinson's squadron, men who understood the tactical importance of altitude advantage and who could be trusted not to discuss technical details with officers who might ask uncomfortable questions. They were told simply that their aircraft had received performance enhancements and they should expect better climb rates at high altitude. Most pilots didn't ask for details. They just wanted aircraft that kept them alive. Before we continue with what happened when these modified Spitfires entered combat, let me ask you something. If you're fascinated by these stories of ordinary people breaking rules to save lives, of unconventional solutions that change the course of battles, then hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the real history that official reports buried, the uncomfortable truths about how wars are actually won. More stories like Davies's are coming, and you won't want to miss them. The first combat test came on August 20th, 1940. Hutchinson led a section of 4 Spitfires, all with modified boost controls, on a patrol over Dover. They encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 109s at 14,000 feet, the Germans holding altitude advantage as usual. Standard tactics said the Spitfires should avoid engagement, maintain defensive posture, and wait for the Germans to attack. But Hutchinson had different options now. He called out on the radio, "Red section, full throttle, climbing attack. Let's take the high ground." The 4 Spitfires pointed their noses up and climbed hard. The German pilots watching from above expected the usual pattern. British fighters climbing slowly, easy targets for diving attacks. Instead, they saw Spitfires climbing at a rate that shouldn't have been possible, eating up the altitude difference faster than doctrine said they could. The Germans hesitated, confused by unexpected performance, and in that moment of hesitation, Hutchinson's section reached equal altitude and kept climbing. 30 seconds later, the British fighters were above the Germans, reversing the tactical situation completely. Hutchinson rolled inverted and dove on the nearest Messerschmitt. The German pilot broke right, diving away, instinctively using the vertical dimension to escape. But now the Spitfire could follow. Hutchinson dove after him, closed the range, fired a 2-second burst from his 8 machine guns. The Messerschmitt's engine erupted in smoke and flame. The German pilot bailed out, parachute deploying at 9,000 feet. Hutchinson pulled out of the dive and immediately climbed back to altitude, his modified Merlin hauling the Spitfire upward faster than the remaining Germans expected. Within 2 minutes, Hutchinson was above them again, holding the advantage, dictating the engagement terms. The combat lasted 8 minutes. Hutchinson's section shot down 3 Messerschmitts confirmed, damaged 2 more, and returned to base without losses. The German pilots debriefed after the war mentioned this engagement specifically. They described Spitfires that climbed impossibly fast, that could match or exceed the Messerschmitt 109's vertical performance, that took away the altitude advantage German tactics depended on. One pilot wrote in his diary, "The Spitfires have become different aircraft. They climb like our own fighters now. The advantage we held is disappearing." More combat encounters through late August and early September confirmed the modification's effectiveness. Pilots flying the 12 modified Spitfires reported consistently better climb performance, improved ability to engage German fighters at high altitude, and greater tactical flexibility. The squadron's kill ratio improved dramatically. In the 2 weeks before the modifications, Hutchinson's squadron had lost 9 aircraft and claimed 12 enemy destroyed. In the 2 weeks after, they lost 2 aircraft and claimed 27 enemy destroyed. The statistics were undeniable. Something had changed. The engineering officers noticed. Squadron leader Thomas Barrett, responsible for aircraft maintenance and engineering standards, called Davies into his office on September 7th. "Sergeant, I've been reviewing our aircraft performance reports. Several pilots are reporting exceptional climb rates at high altitude, significantly better than specification. Can you explain this?" Davies felt his stomach drop. This was the moment he dreaded. He could lie, claim ignorance, protect himself, or he could tell the truth and face court-martial for unauthorized modifications. He chose truth. "Sir, I've modified the boost control units on 12 aircraft. Increased the supercharger pressure from 6 pounds to 9 pounds above 10,000 feet. It improves climb rate by approximately 30% at altitude. The modification is not authorized by Rolls-Royce or Air Ministry specifications, and I take full responsibility for implementing it without approval." Barrett stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, looked out at the flight line where Spitfires were being refueled and rearmed. "You've modified 12 aircraft without authorization. You've exceeded manufacturer specifications. You've put pilots and equipment at risk. This is grounds for court-martial." He turned back to face Davies. "And it's also the most tactically significant improvement to our combat capability I've seen since we got the Spitfires. Our kill ratio has doubled. Our pilots are surviving engagements they'd have lost 2 weeks ago. The Germans are having to adapt their tactics because we've taken away their altitude advantage. You've changed the tactical situation, Sergeant, through unauthorized modification." Barrett sat down heavily. "I should court-martial you. But if I do that, I have to order removal of the modifications, which means condemning pilots to die in engagements they could survive with your illegal boost controls. That's an interesting moral dilemma." Davies said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd made his choice, and now Barrett had to make his. The squadron leader pulled out a notepad and began writing. I'm going to prepare a report for Group Headquarters. In that report, I will state that enhanced boost controls have been field tested and proven effective in combat. I will recommend immediate evaluation by Air Ministry engineering staff for potential fleet-wide implementation. I will credit you as the originating designer, and I will carefully avoid mentioning that this modification was implemented without authorization, tested in combat before any official approval, and violates every procurement regulation in the book. He looked up at Davies. If anyone asks direct questions about the timeline or approval process, I won't lie. But if nobody asks those questions, which they probably won't if the results are good enough, then this modification will appear to be a legitimate field improvement rather than gross insubordination. You understand what I'm doing here, Sergeant? I'm covering your unauthorized actions with bureaucratic language because the results justify the risk you took. Don't make me regret this decision. Keep those aircraft maintained perfectly. If even one engine fails because of your modifications, I will personally destroy you. The report went up the chain of command. Group Captain Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, received it on September 10th. Dowding was a practical man who cared more about winning the Battle of Britain than following regulations perfectly. He read Barrett's report, noted the combat effectiveness statistics, and ordered immediate testing by the Air Ministry's technical staff. Within 48 hours, engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment were at RAF Hornchurch examining Davies's modified Spitfires. The lead engineer, a civilian named Dr. Edmund Sheffield, brought test equipment and a mandate to determine whether the modifications were safe for widespread adoption. He spent 2 days examining the boost control modifications, testing engines on the ground, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing pilots. His preliminary conclusion was cautious. The modification increased engine stress substantially, reduced safety margins, and accelerated component wear. It violated Rolls-Royce specifications and voided all warranties. By every normal engineering standard, it should be prohibited. But Sheffield was also honest about the tactical context. In a memo to his superiors, he wrote, "The modification described by Sergeant Davies increases engine failure risk by an estimated factor of 2 to 3. However, it provides climb rate improvements of 25 to 35% at combat altitudes. In the current tactical situation, where altitude advantage is determining engagement outcomes, this performance improvement saves more pilots than the increased mechanical risk kills. From a purely utilitarian perspective, accepting higher engine failure rates in exchange for better combat performance is justified." The memo reached Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, which was bearing the brunt of the Battle of Britain. Park read Sheffield's analysis and made the command decision. Implement the modification across all operational Spitfire squadrons in 11 Group. Accept the increased maintenance burden. Accept the higher engine failure rate. The tactical advantage is worth it. Sergeant Davies will provide technical consultation to ground crews, implementing the modification. This is to be treated as urgent operational priority. Within 3 weeks, over 200 Spitfires had received the boost modification. The implementation was rapid, prioritized over almost everything else, because the tactical situation demanded it. The Battle of Britain was reaching its climax. The Luftwaffe was making maximum effort attacks on British airfields and cities. Every advantage, every marginal improvement in performance mattered. Davies's illegal modification, now legitimized by command authority, was giving British fighters the vertical performance to match their German opponents. The impact on combat outcomes was measurable. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting with increasing frequency that Spitfires were climbing faster, engaging at higher altitudes, maintaining better energy management in vertical maneuvers. The altitude advantage that Messerschmitt pilots had relied on was disappearing. British fighters were meeting German formations at equal or superior altitude, changing the tactical calculus fundamentally. Engagements that German doctrine assumed would favor the attackers were becoming even fights or worse. German intelligence tried to understand what had changed. They recovered wreckage from shot-down Spitfires, examined engines, found evidence of modified boost controls. Their analysis concluded that British fighters were operating at higher power settings than previously observed, probably at the cost of reduced engine reliability. Luftwaffe commanders issued tactical directives. British fighters should be assumed capable of high-altitude performance, equal to or exceeding the Messerschmitt 109. Altitude advantage can no longer be reliably maintained. Adjust tactics accordingly. This was strategic impact from a modification implemented by a sergeant mechanic without authorization. Davies had identified a technical solution to a tactical problem, implemented it despite regulations, proven it in combat, and forced both friend and enemy to adapt to new reality. The modification wasn't perfect. Engine failure rates did increase, roughly doubling as Sheffield had predicted. Maintenance burden increased significantly, but the tactical advantage was worth the cost. British pilots flying modified Spitfires survived at higher rates than those flying standard aircraft, even accounting for increased mechanical failures. The long-term consequences were even more significant. The success of Davies's modification forced Rolls-Royce to reconsider their conservative approach to engine ratings. If field modifications could safely exceed factory specifications, perhaps factory specifications were unnecessarily cautious. This led to the development of the Merlin 45 and subsequent variants, which incorporated higher boost pressures as standard. The performance improvements Davies had achieved through unauthorized modification became built into later production engines, giving all British fighters better high-altitude performance. The modification also influenced maintenance doctrine. The Air Ministry realized that experienced ground crews understood aircraft capabilities at a level that formal engineering sometimes missed. This led to more systematic channels for field improvements, for bottom-up innovation, for practical knowledge to influence official specifications. Davies's experience demonstrated that expertise existed outside the engineering establishment, that mechanics who worked with equipment daily often understood its real capabilities better than designers who worked from theoretical models. Dr. Sheffield, the engineer who'd evaluated Davies's modification, wrote about this in a post-war technical memoir. "We engineers design to specifications based on worst-case assumptions. We build in safety margins for imperfect maintenance, variable fuel quality, and operator abuse. These margins are necessary for fleet-wide operations, but they also leave performance on the table." Sergeant Davies understood that in specific operational contexts, with excellent maintenance and consistent conditions, those margins could be reduced. He was right, and his practical knowledge saved lives. The engineering profession should be humble enough to learn from mechanics who understand real-world performance. The story became legend within RAF maintenance crews, though it was never publicly discussed during the war. Sergeant Davies, who'd modified the Spitfire boost controls, who'd broken regulations to give pilots a fighting chance, who'd changed the Battle of Britain through unauthorized engineering. Other mechanics heard the story and understood its lesson. Sometimes following regulations meant accepting unnecessary limitations. Sometimes the right thing required breaking rules. Sometimes expertise from below could solve problems. Authority from above couldn't see. Davies was promoted to flight sergeant in October 1940, an unusual advancement for someone without formal engineering education. The promotion came with a quiet understanding that he'd contributed significantly to fighter command's effectiveness, though official records carefully avoided specifying exactly what that contribution was. He continued working at RAF Hornchurch through the rest of the war, training other mechanics, consulting on engine modifications, applying his practical knowledge to continuous improvement of aircraft performance. The moral dimension of Davies's actions is worth examining. He deliberately violated regulations, implementing modifications without authorization, exceeding manufacturer specifications, putting pilots at risk of mechanical failure. By normal standards of military discipline, he should have been court-martialed. But context matters. British pilots were dying because German fighters had tactical advantages. Davies had the knowledge to address one of those advantages. Following regulations meant accepting unnecessary deaths. Breaking regulations meant taking personal risk to save others. This is the classic dilemma of institutional versus individual responsibility. Institutions create rules to prevent chaos, to ensure consistency, to protect against worst-case scenarios. But rules designed for general application sometimes fail in specific contexts. The individual who sees this gap faces a choice: follow rules and accept suboptimal outcomes, or break rules and accept personal consequences. Davies chose to break rules, but he did so with full understanding of potential costs. He didn't hide behind authority or pass responsibility. He owned his decision completely. The institutional response was equally interesting. Squadron leader Barrett recognized that Davies had violated regulations, but also that the violation had produced valuable results. Rather than rigidly enforcing rules, Barrett used discretion, protecting Davies while channeling the innovation through proper review processes. This pragmatic approach acknowledged that rules serve purposes, and when following rules contradicts those purposes, flexibility is appropriate. Barrett didn't abandon institutional structure, but he didn't let it prevent beneficial innovation. This balance between institutional discipline and individual initiative is difficult to maintain. Organizations that enforce rules rigidly prevent innovation and adaptability. Organizations that tolerate routine rule-breaking descend into chaos. The British military in 1940 threaded this needle successfully, at least in Davies's case. They disciplined rule-breaking that harmed effectiveness while protecting rule-breaking that saved lives. That distinction required judgment, wisdom, and willingness to evaluate outcomes rather than just process. The German military, by contrast, struggled with this balance. Their engineering culture was more rigid, more hierarchical, more dependent on formal processes. Field modifications were rare and usually suppressed. This gave them consistency and reliability, but also prevented them from adapting quickly to tactical problems. The Messerschmitt's altitude advantage should have been maintained through continuous improvement. But German engineering processes were too slow to respond to British field modifications. By the time they developed countermeasures, the tactical situation had shifted. This asymmetry in innovation speed was strategically significant. Britain's ability to implement field modifications quickly, to turn practical knowledge into tactical advantage within weeks, gave them adaptation speed Germany couldn't match. It wasn't that German engineers were less capable. It was that British command structure allowed bottom-up innovation to influence top-down decisions faster. Davies's modification was implemented fleet-wide within a month of first combat test. German equivalents would have required months of committee reviews and formal testing. The human cost of Davies' modification is impossible to calculate precisely but clearly positive. Engine failure rates doubled, which meant some pilots died from mechanical problems who wouldn't have otherwise. But combat survival rates improved more than engine failure rates increased, meaning the net effect saved lives. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Accept 10 additional engine failures per 1,000 sorties, in exchange for 25 fewer combat losses per 1,000 sorties. The trade was worth it. Individual tragedies complicate this calculation. Pilot Officer Martin Webster died on September 24th when his modified engine failed during combat over London. He was 22 years old. His death was directly attributable to Davies's modification, to the higher stress on engines operating at 9 pounds of boost. If Webster had been flying a standard Spitfire, his engine wouldn't have failed. But if British fighters hadn't been modified, dozens of other pilots would have died from combat disadvantages. Webster's death was tragic and necessary simultaneously, an individual cost of collective survival. Davies thought about men like Webster, the pilots who died from mechanical failures his modifications caused. He couldn't escape the moral weight of those deaths, couldn't tell himself they were just acceptable casualties. They were real human beings who died because of choices he'd made. That burden never left him. In post-war interviews, Davies spoke about this burden openly. "I modified those engines knowing some would fail, knowing that pilots would die from mechanical problems they wouldn't have faced otherwise. I made that choice because more pilots would die without the modifications. But knowing you made the right choice doesn't make individual deaths any easier to carry." This honesty is unusual and valuable. Military culture often celebrates innovation and victory without acknowledging costs. Davies refused that simplification. He'd saved lives through unauthorized modification, but he'd also caused deaths through increased mechanical stress. Both realities existed together. Pretending only one was true would dishonor the men who died so others could live. Accepting both was psychological burden Davies carried for life, the price of making decisions with life or death consequences. If you followed this story to this point, you're clearly someone who appreciates the complexity of real history, who understands that heroism often comes with costs, and that doing the right thing isn't always clean or simple. That's exactly the community we're building here. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that bell icon, and share this with anyone who loves history that makes them think. The real stories are always more complicated than the headlines, and we're committed to telling them honestly. The technical evolution of the Spitfire continued through the war, each new variant incorporating lessons learned from combat and field modifications. The Merlin 45 engine, introduced in 1941, had higher boost ratings as standard, incorporating Davies's insight about operational margins. Later variants pushed performance even further, with some versions achieving boost pressures of 12 pounds or more, double the original conservative specifications. The Spitfire's evolution from a good fighter to a great one was partly driven by unauthorized field modifications that proved performance could safely exceed official ratings. This pattern repeated with other aircraft systems. Armament modifications, aerodynamic improvements, radio equipment upgrades, many originated from field mechanics and pilots, rather than design offices. The British aircraft industry's responsiveness to field feedback, its willingness to incorporate unauthorized improvements when they proved effective, was competitive advantage. German and Japanese aircraft designs, by contrast, were often locked into original specifications, changed only through lengthy formal processes that couldn't respond quickly to combat experience. The Spitfire's legendary status in British culture owes something to Davies and mechanics like him. The aircraft performed better in combat than its design specifications suggested because field modifications extracted capability the designers had conservatively left unused. The Spitfire pilots flew wasn't quite the Spitfire Reginald Mitchell design. It was that design enhanced by practical knowledge, improved by men who worked with the machines daily, optimized through combat experience. This collaboration between design and maintenance, between engineering theory and practical expertise, made British aircraft more effective than some of their components. Davies served with the RAF through 1945. He was involved in similar field modification programs for other aircraft types, though none had the dramatic impact of the Spitfire boost modification. After the war, he worked for Rolls-Royce as a field service representative. essentially making a career of the same practical engineering that had characterized his military service. He traveled to air forces around the world, helping them maintain and optimize Merlin engines, passing on knowledge he'd accumulated through years of hands-on experience. He died in 1978 at age 80, respected within engineering circles, but largely unknown to general public. His obituary in the aviation trade press mentioned his contributions to Merlin engine development, but didn't specify details. The full story of the unauthorized boost modification wasn't publicly discussed until the 1990s, when historians researching Battle of Britain technical developments found references in classified documents. By then, most participants were dead, and the story could be told without professional consequences. Davies's widow, interviewed in 1996, confirmed the basic facts and added human details. He never talked about it much, she said, but sometimes at night he'd mention names of pilots, young men who died. I think he carried that weight his whole life. The lesson of Davies's story extends beyond technical details about supercharger boost and Merlin engines. It's about the space between regulations and reality, between what's authorized and what's necessary, between following orders and using judgment. Military organizations require discipline, but they also require adaptability. The tension between these needs is permanent and unresolvable. The best organizations don't eliminate the tension, but manage it, creating space for necessary rule-breaking while maintaining overall discipline. Davies operated in that space. He broke regulations deliberately, knowingly, accepting personal consequences if things went wrong. But he did so for valid reasons, based on genuine expertise, with clear understanding of risks and benefits. He wasn't being reckless or insubordinate for its own sake. He was applying professional judgment to a situation where regulations didn't match reality. That distinction matters. Not all rule-breaking is justified, but some is, and distinguishing justified from unjustified requires wisdom that rules themselves can't provide. Modern military organizations still struggle with this balance. Procurement regulations have become more complex, safety requirements more stringent, oversight more intensive. This prevents some problems, but also makes field innovation harder. The days when a sergeant mechanic could modify aircraft engines overnight and test modifications in combat the next morning are gone, probably for good reasons. But something valuable was lost too. The ability to identify problems at ground level and implement solutions quickly, without waiting for bureaucratic approval, gave World War II Britain adaptation speed that's harder to achieve now. The engineering culture that produced Davies, that trained mechanics to think systematically about performance optimization, that valued practical knowledge alongside theoretical education, was also lost somewhat. Modern aviation maintenance is more specialized, more dependent on computers and diagnostic equipment, less dependent on mechanics' intuition and accumulated experience. This brings precision, but also reduces the kind of creative problem-solving Davies embodied. The mechanic who deeply understands his engines, who can identify performance margins through feel and observation, who can implement improvements without formal engineering support, is becoming rarer. Perhaps that's inevitable as technology becomes more complex. Perhaps it's concerning as organizations become less able to adapt quickly to unexpected challenges. Both perspectives have merit. What's certain is that World War II Britain benefited enormously from having mechanics like Davies. From command structures flexible enough to protect beneficial rule-breaking. From tactical situations desperate enough that unauthorized solutions were welcomed rather than punished. That combination produced innovation at speed modern systems struggle to match. The Spitfire's combat record speaks for itself. Over 20,000 were built. They served on every front. They shot down more enemy aircraft than any other British fighter. They became symbols of British resistance and determination. But behind that symbolic status was practical reality. The Spitfire worked because brilliant designers like Reginald Mitchell created excellent foundations, and then practical mechanics like Walter Davies improved those foundations through field modifications, unauthorized but necessary. Both contributions mattered. The legend and the technical reality were inseparable. Davies never received formal recognition for his modification. No medal, no commendation, no mention in official histories. He was fine with that. He'd done the work because it needed doing, because pilots were dying, and he had knowledge to help them. Recognition would have been nice, but it wasn't why he'd broken regulations and risked court-martial. He'd done it for the 22-year-old pilots who climbed into Spitfires every morning, not knowing if they'd return, who faced German fighters with altitude advantages that killed efficiently. Davies gave them technical equality, a fighting chance, survival odds that shifted from desperate to merely dangerous. That's heroism without glory. Doing necessary things that might destroy your career, accepting moral weight of decisions with life or death consequences, carrying burden of deaths your choices caused, while knowing those choices saved more than they cost. Davies embodied this kind of heroism, the quiet kind that changes outcomes without expecting recognition, that measures success in lives saved rather than honors received, that accepts historical invisibility as cost of doing what had to be done. In the final analysis, Davies's unauthorized modification mattered because it worked. It gave Spitfire's climb performance that matched or exceeded the Messerschmitt 109 at high altitude. It removed German tactical advantage in the vertical dimension. It forced Luftwaffe pilots to change tactics and accept that British fighters could no longer be dominated through superior climb rate. It saved British pilots' lives and killed German pilots who'd relied on altitude advantage. The modification was illegal, unauthorized, risky, and absolutely necessary. All those things were true simultaneously. The story deserves remembering not because Davies was some kind of engineering genius, though he was skilled, but because he represented something important about how wars are actually won. They're won by people who see problems and solve them rather than waiting for authorization. They're won by institutions smart enough to protect beneficial rule-breaking. They're won by commanders who value results over process when survival demands it. They're won by accepting that sometimes the right choice is the unauthorized one, and that's okay as long as you're willing to own the consequences. Walter Davies, Sergeant Mechanic, working nights in a hangar at RAF Hornchurch, modifying boost controls without authorization, giving British pilots the altitude performance to match their enemies. That's how the Spitfire became legendary. Not just through brilliant design, but through practical improvement by mechanics who understood that regulations were guides, not absolutes. That survival sometimes required breaking rules. That protecting pilots mattered more than following specifications. Davies broke the rules and saved lives. That's the real story. Complicated and uncomfortable and true. The 12 Spitfires. Davies' first modified flew through the Battle of Britain and beyond. Some were lost in combat, some crashed from mechanical failure, some survived the war and were scrapped during demobilization. None exist today. The physical evidence of Davies's work disappeared into history, melted down or lost or simply worn out. What remains is documentation, scattered across archives, incomplete but sufficient to reconstruct what happened. And what remains is impact, the tactical advantage that helped Britain survive its darkest hour, the lives saved by an unauthorized modification implemented by a mechanic who cared more about results than regulations. That impact is Davies's monument. Not bronze or stone, but outcomes. Pilots who survived because their Spitfires could climb faster. Engagements won because British fighters held altitude advantage. The Battle of Britain itself, influenced by accumulated small advantages, including Davies's contribution. History is built from thousands of such contributions, most unrecognized, most invisible in official accounts, all essential to final outcomes. Davies's story stands for all of them, for every mechanic and engineer and soldier who made small improvements that accumulated into victory. The title promised a story about an illegal fix that made Spitfires outclimb the Messerschmitt 109. That's accurate, but incomplete. The real story is about expertise from unexpected places, about institutions flexible enough to benefit from unauthorized innovation, about individuals willing to break rules for valid reasons, about the moral weight of decisions that save some lives by accepting risk to others. The real story is about how wars are actually won, through accumulated advantages built by people whose names history forgets, but whose contributions determined outcomes. Walter Davies, RAF Sergeant, Mechanic, Problem Solver, Rule Breaker, Lifesaver. The man who made the Spitfire better through unauthorized modification and never received recognition because recognition would require admitting that regulations had been violated. He did the work anyway, carried the moral weight privately, and died knowing he'd contributed to Britain's survival in ways official history would never acknowledge. That's the real story. That's what matters. And that's why 75 years later, we're still talking about an illegal fix that changed the Battle of Britain by giving British fighters the altitude performance to match their enemies and survive.